So we all the time hear about how hard it is to be a principal or a supervisor. Um, Clearly, folks are overworked, right? That's no mystery. There's a ton to do in school, and there's a ton of responsibilities that are going to fall to our shoulders as building leaders, right? Well, in these set of chapters in this module, we really start to break down what's going on there and what's important. And in fact, some of those really challenging choices and the necessary things that we have to both embrace and perhaps give up, and also recognize some of the forces and the different ways in which we are pulled in this work. So in chapter 12, for example, which talks about the assessing and planning skills that we need to engage in to do our supervisory work successfully and effectively. It's one thing, as we've talked about in these prior modules, to have an orientation towards a non-directive or a collaborative style of leadership. But how do you actually set yourself up so that you can do that, right? Clearly, it takes time and investment to be able to pull that off. So chapter 12 gives us a way of thinking through that systematically, right? So that we can actually make ourselves available both in terms of time, but also in terms of our own attention and energy, how we're going to put into that. So that's a really interesting chapter. I think you'll enjoy that very much. Um, Observing skills. Again, we've seen each other teach maybe a little bit, but how and what do we look for? Where are we putting our attention? Um, you may have heard, for example, a whole school of thought that says we shouldn't watch the teacher at all. We should be watching the students and seeing what happens with the students. Um, this chapter 13 begins to, again, get into what are the different ways that we can do observing. There's a ton going on in any given classroom. Where do we put our attention? Who do we invite into that conversation? Maybe we do collaborative forms of observation. So I think you'll enjoy that piece too. And finally, in terms of evaluation, when we start using all of the observations and assessments and so forth that we've been doing to start making some judgments and some evaluations, what are the purposes for which we're doing that? Are we doing that in a formative relationship in which our idea is that this is for the growth of the teacher and then ultimately for the growth of the kids? Or these summative evaluations? They're really different. And we've spent way too much time in education pretending that the summative evaluations that we give to kids, standardized testing, are really functioning as formative, because they're not, right? And we don't want to fall into the same trap with the work that we do in supervising and evaluating instruction of teachers, right? We want to make sure that we're being clear what's formative and what's summative. And this, frankly, in my experience, has been one of the more difficult things to face, because I certainly saw myself wanting to be in the formative evaluation role, right? I was here to help people grow. Well, there are many of the structures of school in which a principal's evaluation is really summative. And the formative work goes to coaches and supervisors, because it's principals, which I was, who are making the judgments about somebody's career advancement and where they settle in those rubrics. So it's a really interesting tension, and will depend somewhat on the culture of your district, but also the history of what people have gotten used to. And frankly, in this culture in which we live of summative evaluation, principals get pushed more and more into that role, whereas supervisors tend to get pushed more into the coaching and formative role. Anyway, I think you'll really get into the nitty gritty. As we said before, the last module was on the nitty gritty of how those roles looked. Okay, so how do you actually do it? How do you make yourself available to it? What are the things you have to embrace? What are the things you may have to give up? Very interesting. I think you'll enjoy.